Today's daf, we're going to be learning a Sanhedrin daf Lamed Gimel. Today's daf is sponsored by Leah Brick in memory of her great niece, Navatova Bat Yoshua Yisrael Leah Viliora Charna Cherny on her third yurtzeit. In her schut, may we see all of the hostages released now and refuah shlema to all Chole Yisrael. Amen. We're going to get started with the top of our daf. Dine mamonot machzirim. Today, this is going to be our main topic. The fact that dine mamonot machzirim bein l'schut bein l'chova. If the judges rule and then realize they made a mistake, there was something wrong, there was something they didn't know, they can change the ruling in dine mamonot in either direction, schut or chova. In dine nefashot, they can only change it l'schut, but not l'chova. That we're going to get to later. Right now, we're going to focus on this law that basically seems to imply very clearly that dine mamonot you can undo in either direction. So you made a mistake, it gets undone. This is going to be a big problem, and it's a bit of a complicated sugya. That's why there's a study guide today to help you organize it as best as possible. This contradicts the following Mishnah. It's a Mishnah in Bechorot, and the Mishnah is Dan etadin zikat chayav chayevet hasakai. So the judges ruled a case, and they said that someone was innocent and was exempt instead of liable. Chayevet hasakai, liable instead of exempt. Or let's say they ruled that something was impure when it was really pure, or pure when it was impure. Masha asa asui. Now, this is basically the same as our Mishnah. A mistake was made. Okay, zikat chayav chayev sadakai would be, we assume, dine mamonot, monetary law. Whatever was done is done. Now, that's the opposite of what we just said. Our Mishnah says we undo it, right? This says what was done. The judgment stands. Exact total opposite of our Mishnah. V'yishalemi beito, and the judge pays out of pocket. Now you might remember we learned, when does the judge pay out of pocket? When the judge is not a mumche. If the judge is a mumche, the judge is not going to have to pay out of pocket. And it actually says that in the continuation of the Mishnah, but right now they just quoted the beginning part because we don't need that just yet. And we will get to it soon. But we're basically going to say here, according to our Mishnah, the judgment is undone if there's a mistake. Either direction, it doesn't matter what direction. And the Mishnah in Bechorot says it doesn't matter which direction, the judgment stands. Very confusing. So we're going to have three answers to this question. And each time we're going to have an answer, we're going to raise questions or difficulties with the answer. Okay, so each answer is going to have at least one difficulty with it, or I guess really one difficulty, but some are going to end up difficulty with the answer that's going to have a difficulty, it's going to have an answer, it's going to have a difficulty, as you can see. Okay, Amar Rav Yosef, lo kashya. Now, what we're going to have to do in each answer, we're going to establish that the case of the Mishnah here was different than the case of the Mishnah in Bechorot. Okay? So again, keep in your head, our Mishnah says undone, the other Mishnah says the judgment stands. Amar Rav Yosef, lo kashya kam b'mumche kam b'she'eno mumche. If you have an expert judge that makes a mistake, we undo the judgment. Why? Because we assume that when the judge, who was a mumche, realized his mistake and now realized he was wrong, he's actually correct now. But and that's our Mishnah, which means it's undone. But the Mishnah in Bechorot, which says it's not undone, is b'she'eno mumche. Why is that? So Rashi explains that b'she'eno mumche, in the Rashi Dibor Matchil b'mumche, toward the end or the middle of it, Matze Amrle, the person could say, or whoever we could say, Mi Amr Ditama Batra Didachikar, Dilmatama Kami Ikaru Bahayu Ditai. If a regular person is judging and makes a mistake and then says, oh, I made a mistake, it should be this way. Who's to say they're right the second time and not the first time? There's an assumption that mumchim know what they're talking about. So now, of course, no one knew what they were talking about here because everybody made a mistake. But the assumption is when it's a real experienced judge, they'll realize their mistake and they'll know now they're correct. But when it's somebody who is not a mumche, and they're not so knowledgeable in the law or in how to judge, who's to say, or they're not experienced judges, who's to say that when they said now they made a mistake, they realized their mistake, maybe they're going to come tomorrow and say, oh no, that was really wrong. So because we don't fully trust them, so we just say whatever you did is done, and we're not going to change it because what we're going to change it again and change it again. There's no reason to think like, the person who already was exempt, now you're going to make them obligated, or the person who was, they're going to say, no, you already exempted me, and maybe you were right then, and you can't make me pay now based on, you're claiming that now you think you know better. So that's an interesting answer. True or not true? Good question. Well, now the Gemara is going to ask a question on this. But wait, you're saying that the Mishnah in Bechorot is a case of a non-mumche, right? Not an experienced judge, and that's why. Ube-mumche machzirim. So then you're going to say, right? That's what we just said. A mumche, if it was a mumche, we're going to return the judgment. But b'hakatane, but look at that Mishnah in Bechorot. What does it say there? Im haya mumche lebeitin patur milashalem. It says there, which I already mentioned before, right? It said in the Mishnah, Masha asasui. The judgment is a judgment. We don't change it. And then we said, and the judge has to pay out of pocket. But then the Mishnah continues and says, when does the judge pay out of pocket if the judge wasn't a mumche? But if the judge was a mumche, an expert judge, then the judge doesn't have to pay out of pocket. Now, it doesn't say the judgment is erased, right? We return the judgment, we change it. No, it's still masha asui. First of all, you wouldn't have to be exempt from payment if the judgment goes right. If we change the judgment, then of course you're exempt from payment. There is no payment because everything goes back to the way it's supposed to be. So that Mishnah clearly indicates it's even talking about mumchim. And what do we see? You can't say like we tried to say, which is our Mishnah is talking about mumchim. Mumche makes a mistake, we change the judgment. No, masha asasui, it's done. It's just that the judge doesn't have to pay out of pocket to reimburse for the mistake. So, how can Rav Yosef really explain the Mishnah and the contradiction between the two Mishnayot in that way? So, to answer that question, Amar Rav Nachman, kan sheyesh gadol himenu bechokma uveminyan, kan she'en gadol himenu bechokma uveminyan. Comes Rav Nachman and says, there's two different cases of mumche. There's mumche in our Mishnah. Our Mishnah is definitely mumche, and that's why the judgment is changed. Then there's the Mishnah in Bechorot, which is the judgment stands. They both can be explained with mumchim. What's the difference? Well, if there's a greater court than that court, then the greater court can figure out and assess what, right? Greater court is always defined as greater b'chokhmah v'binyan. They have more intelligence and more people. Okay, there's a bigger debate about how to understand more people because aren't the courts all the same sizes? I mean, there are different sizes. I'm not going to get into that right now, but basically it means when there's someone above them who can clarify, are they really correct the second time? Because that's the whole question. When you say, oh, we made a mistake, who's to say you're right this time? So even mumchim, we're not sure, as opposed to before where we thought Rav Yosef was saying, any mumche who makes a mistake and says, now I got it right, we assume they're right. And if you're not a mumche, we have no idea. So we're going to leave the judgment as it was. But now we're going to say even mumchim, we're going to leave a judgment. When is that? When there's no higher court, basically, that can come in and say, oh, yeah, your second time was more correct. So then we leave it because maybe also the judges are wrong. But our Mishnah is talking about a case where there's a higher court or a more prominent court, better, stronger rabbis, more learned, more experienced, and they can come and clarify and say, you're right. The second time you were right, the first time you were wrong, then they can undo the judgment. That's answer number one. So we have answer number one, mumchim, ena mumchim, and then we had to clarify within that a little more, mumchim when there's a higher court above them. And the other Mishnah is mumchim, ena mumchim, but when is it the mumchim in the other Mishnah where we leave the judgment? When there's no one higher than them. Second answer, Rav Sheshet Amar. Kam b'ta'a b'dvar Mishnah, kam b'ta'a b'shikul hadat. Depends what kind of a mistake. Okay, we hadn't discussed that yet. What kind of a mistake? If the mistake was, they made a mistake in an explicit Mishnah. Well, if they didn't know an explicit Mishnah and they made a mistake, of course we're going to undo that judgment because it's such a basic, obvious thing that they made a mistake that we're going to have to redo and flip the judgment. If you were to have a shikul hadat with assessing how we should rule in this case, and we're going to have to explain exactly what this is, but let's just leave it very vague right now. If you made a mistake in judgment, meaning like how you judge, not just in the judgment, but you made a mistake in judging, making the proper call about what one should rule in this case, then we're going to say, well, that's not as clear-cut a mistake as the first one, and therefore we're going to leave it. Masha asasui, and that's the Mishnah in Bechorot. Now here it's a bit of a strange structure because Rav Sheshet gives this answer, and then they quote Rav Sheshet saying something in the name of someone else that fits perfectly with this. sort of maybe saying he's consistent within his approach, but it's sort of, usually we'll bring something someone else said to clarify this, but what happens to be Rav Sheshan himself. To Amar Rav Sheshan, Amar Rav Asi, said somewhere else, to Abid Var Mishnah Choser, to Abid Shikul Adat Eino Choser. So the answer he gave here also, by the way, he said somewhere else. I don't know, it doesn't add anything, that line, but we're bringing it anyway. But now before we get to the difficulty on this approach, because I told you each of these answers is going to have difficulties. First, we're going to talk about a few questions that arise, not difficulties, but just questions about this. We have ta'abit. So the first is going to be on ta'abit var Mishnah. The second is going to be on shikul adat. So, Amalei Ravina Rav Ashi. I want to remind you, it's important for our sugi here. Who Ravina Rav Ashi? They're the last of the Amoraim, and they're the ones. They're called Sof Hora'ah. They're the end of the teachings, and they're the ones who are attributed to them that they put together the Gemara. Okay, they edited it, organized it. Must have been edited over time, and they kind of, just like Rabbi Yehuda Nasi didn't write all the Mishnayot, they existed, and he formed it into a book. So Ravina and Rav Ashi get the credit for the Gemara. Okay, not the whole Gemara, because there's some things that were added after their time from the Stama, from the next time period. We're not going to talk about all that right now, but just it's interesting to see this in light of the sugya. So Ravina and Rav Ashi say, Afilu ta'abed Rabbi Chia v'Rabbi Yoshaya. So Ravina says to Rav Ashi, what about, now you said ta'abed var Mishnah. Or Rav Sheshet said ta'abed var Mishnah. What if, now the Mishnah is the book that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi put together. What if it's the Tanaitic sources that Rabbi Chia put together, which we generally say is the Tosefta? Or Rabbi Yoshaya had his own book of Mishnayot, or, Brightot. Tanaitic sources that they put together in a book. So what about those? What if you made a mistake in that? Are we saying, do you think Rosh Hashanah meant only Mishnah? Or does it include these other things as well? Amar Le'in, he says, oh yeah, those are included too. In other words, any basic Tanaitic sources are very clear cut. They made a mistake in that. We're gonna revert the judgment back to what it should be. Or flip the judgment. Afilu b'deravu Shmuel. Now remember, Tanaitic sources always have higher status. What about Rav and Shmuel, first generation Amoraim? What if they made a mistake in something that was a clear-cut ruling of Rav and Shmuel? Amar Le'in, yes. Also, we're going to say it's Choser. Again, our Mishnah is referring to that as well. Afilu b'didi v'didach, what about you and me? What about something the two of us said? Where would that go? Amar Le, here's his funny answer. Atu anan kat lekane ba'agva anan? What, do you think we cut reeds? We're Talmidei Chachamim. Of course, what we say is going to be, if someone makes a mistake in our ruling, by the way, I want to remind you, because they finish up the Gemara, Rav Ashi often has the bottom line in the sugya, and we often hold, if there's a machloket, oftentimes we'll hold like Rav Ashi, because he's the later. There's this concept of halacha kebatrai, the halacha follows the later authorities, and basically, they're saying, Rav Ashi says, yes, of course, we're not just, blue-collar workers here. We sit in the Beit Midrash, we learn, we are the ones who can answer these questions. Right? So we are the learned ones, and therefore, yes, if they made a mistake in a ruling of ours, there was a clear-cut ruling, yes, the law is going to go back. Okay, that was question number one. Question number two. Heichidami shikul adat. What is the case of shikul adat? What does that mean that they made a mistake? Right? It's not ta'abed var Mishnah, it's shikul adat, and that's the case where we're going to say, since it's not as clear-cut as a Mishnah, or now we learn, or as Rav and Shmuel, or as or Brightot of Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Yoshai, or of Rav and Shmuel, or of Ravina or Rav Ashi, but shikul hadat. So what is shikul hadat? Then we're going to say whatever they ruled stands still, even though they think it makes a mistake. They made a mistake. So what's the answer? He says, what is shikul hadat? Amar of Papa kigon trei t'nai or trei amorai de plige hadade. It's a case where we have two amoraim or two tanaim arguing against each other. I would say that's most of the cases of the Gemara. V'lo itmar hilchata lo kemar v'lo kemar. And there's no clear-cut psak halacha, who we hold like. That's not everything, right? There are a lot of cases where it is clear. There's lots of cases where it's not clear. So it's not clear who we hold like. V'ikre v'avi kechaminayhu. And these judges, or this judge, acted up based on one of them. V'sugya deshmata azu ki'idach. But the way the sugya goes seems to be much more on the other side. Okay, and we've seen that sometimes where they seem to raise difficulties against the other side, many more difficulties against one side than the other, or they end with a tiyuv Torah or kasha or something doesn't make sense, and then that would be an indicator that we don't necessarily hold that way. So first they held like the other way, and then they realized that really the sugya seems to go the other way. That's called shikul hadat because it's not clear cut. And that's the case where we're going to leave it. Okay? That's haynu shikul hadat. Okay, so like I said, what did we do here? We had two answers so far. How to resolve the contradiction. We had a difficulty with the first one, resolved it. We brought the second one, and then we had two questions that kind of branch off of it, which is what's included into Abed Bar Mishnah, and what does Shikul Hadat mean? Those are more definitive questions. Those are, meaning not definitive, how to define things. Okay, how do we define Abed Bar Mishnah, and how do we define Shikul Hadat? Now we're going back to the difficulty with Rav Sheshet Shita. Okay, and this is we're going to see right now. Eitive Rav Hamnuna le Rav Sheshet. Rav Hamnuna brings a difficulty to Rav Sheshet on Rav Sheshet from the Mishna in Bechorot. Now the Mishna on that same daf says, Ma'aseh b'para shenitla ha'em shala. There was a case of a cow that they had taken out the womb of the cow. Ve'echila Rabbi Tarfon leklavim. And Rabbi Tarfon said that is a treifa. What does a treifa mean? It's an animal that's going to die within 12 months because they took out her womb. And Rabbi Tarfon said that's not kosher and fed it to the dogs. Okay, which basically means, right, like a nevela, which is also non-kosher. It's not shechted properly, both treifa and nevela. The same thing. They can only, according to the Torah, what does it say? La kelef tashlichuno. Give it to the dogs. So they're saying basically he ruled this is not kosher and give it to the dogs. But the case then came before the rabbis in Yavne, and they said it's permitted. This is not a treifa. Sha'amal todus harofeh, very fascinating case. They went to a doctor, okay, which maybe you would call him a scientist, okay, or a veterinarian or something who understood animals and scientific things, and said, "Ein para v'chazira yotzei me'Alexandria shel Mitzrayim ela im ken chotrim ha'em shela kedei shelo teled." It was something that they did in Alexandria in Egypt. They would take out the wombs of the cows and the pigs, and they would do it, right, so the animal would get stronger. They didn't want them to become pregnant. So, and what do you see? They did it and they didn't die within a year. In other words, people do this all the time. This is a method they use and the animals don't die. So it's not a treifa. Amar Rabbi Tarfon, ha chamor ha Tarfon. Rabbi Tarfon says to himself, Tarfon, there goes your donkey. What does that mean? He's going to now have to pay his donkey because of the loss he caused them for this mistaken ruling. Amar Rabbi Akiva, and this is the key line because it doesn't really matter what happened in the case. What's going to concern us is what is Rabbi Akiva's response. He says to Rabbi Tarfon, Paturata, shekolam rabim patur milashalem. You are exempt. Why? Because anyone who is a mumche rabim, who's an expert judge, even if the judge makes a mistake, he doesn't have to pay. Now, what does this mean? Does the judgment stand? Yes. Does he have to pay? No. What does that match? Well, first of all, this is in the Mishna in Bechorot. It makes sense. It matches the Mishna in Bechorot. This is a perfect proof for when a judge makes a mistake, right? What happens? The judgment stands, and the judge, who's an expert judge, doesn't have to pay. Well, now, what you don't know, or maybe you know, I don't know, but let's assume you don't know this, but there's a Mishnah in Chulin explicitly that says this. In other words, the ruling is, there's a Mishnah in Chulin, a different Mishnah that says that taking out a womb of an animal is not a treifa. So Rabbi Tarfon made a mistake in an explicit Mishnah. Now, if it's a mistake in explicit Mishnah according to Rav Sheshet, what do we say? The judgment is overturned. Not that the judgment stands and the judge is exempt because he's a mumche, like Rabbi Akiva said. Rabbi Akiva should have said to him, oh, don't worry about it because the judgment goes back and then you didn't cause any loss of money. Now, we have a bit of a problem with that, which we're going to get back to, which is, of course, he caused a loss of money. They already gave the meat to the dogs. The meat is gone. We'll get back to that. But let's assume you don't think about that yet. So now let's read that in the Gemara. Right? Rabbi Akiva doesn't match what Rav Sheshet claims because Rav Sheshet said to Abid Var Mishnah Choser, the ruling is overturned, and that's not what Rabbi Akiva said. So we're going to say maybe Rabbi Akiva did say that. How so? What he said was this and more. Okay, meaning the more is what we heard. We didn't hear the this. So this is a very common structure as an answer the Gemara likes to give. Firstly, to'ebid var mishnata, v'to'ebid var mishnah choser. Okay, first things first. Okay, now again, he didn't say this, but we're assuming that this was implied, which is Rabbi Akiva, of course, said to Rabbi Tarfon, you were to Abid Bar Mishnah, and it's Choser, so don't worry. And as Rabbi Akiva was just trying to appease Rabbi Tarfon, don't worry, you're going to have to pay out of pocket. Of course, you don't have to pay out of pocket here. This was a mistake in an explicit Mishnah, and there's no paying out of pocket because the law is overturned. Ve'od, and furthermore, inami b'shikul adat ta'ita. And even if this wasn't an explicit Mishnah, okay, what he's trying to say is for the future, if this happens to you again, don't worry. Because if, let's say, you made a mistake in shikul adat, in, figuring out who to paskin, like where it's not so clear cut, mumche l'rabim ata, you're a specialist, you're an expert. V'chol mumche l'rabim patur milashalem. And anyone who's an expert doesn't have to pay. So that's how we resolved it. But now we're going to zoom in to something that happened here and go back to something I already mentioned, which is, so we basically resolved the problem, but in resolving the problem though, okay, we're now going to ask a question about the question in the first place and say, what kind of a question did Rav Hamnuna ask? Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak l'Rava, my kamotiv Rav Hamnuna l'Rav Sheshet mipara. How could he have asked the question from this case? And this is exactly what I said before, right? I said, let's leave it for right now, but we're going to come back to this, which is, this is a totally irrelevant case for overturning the judgment and saying Rabbi Tarfon didn't have to pay because there is no way to overturn the judgment. It was already eaten by the dogs. So if you were the owner of this treifa, and which wasn't a treifa, this para that now Rabbi Tarfon rules it goes to the dogs, and the dogs ate it. Well, how on earth could did I say something wrong? Yeah, okay, but they sent it to the dogs. The dogs ate the cow. There's no cow to return, so it can't possibly be we're going to overturn the judgment. There's nothing to do anymore. It's done. So this is the way you'd have to understand it, and it's not the easiest answer. Often the questions are better than the answers. If you're going to say to Abid Bar Mishnah, we don't overturn the ruling, Al Makam Dina, then the deen is there. The deen is valid. Okay, this is not what Rav Sheshet said, but that's the whole point of his question. It really only makes sense if you don't go with Rav Sheshet, because you're going to say to Abid Bar Mishnah, the judgment isn't overturned, and Hainu de Kamavchi Rabbi Tarfon, and that's why Rabbi Tarfon was concerned. If the judgment isn't overturned, then Rabbi Tarfon's responsible. Ihu, and then comes Rabbi Akiva and says to him, "Don't worry, right? You're an expert; you don't have to pay." But okay, that didn't really add anything. That was just saying it works with the other side, but it doesn't work, and that's what we have to understand right now. If you say like Rav Sheshet, why? If you think that the ruling is overturned, then lemale, he should have been able to say to Rabbi Tarfon, "You're not responsible to pay. Why not? Even though it's going to be like this, even though we can't overturn the judgment, but." Ilu havai para. If the cow were still in existence, dinach lav dina velo klum avadit. If the para was still here, then you wouldn't have done anything by saying it was a treifa, because now you could just undo it, right? You'd overturn your judgment completely, and there would be no loss of money. So therefore, and now we get into the world of theoretics. Hashda lav klum lo avadit. Hashda nami lo klum avadit. Now also, since even though it happens the cow is gone and the carcass was eaten by the dogs, but had it been in existence, we would have overturned the judgment, and it turns out you wouldn't have done anything. So now we still theoretically overturn the judgment, meaning that theoretically it's as if you're ruling right now it's not a treifa, and the fact that it was eaten by the dogs is not your fault anymore. Because if we go retroactively and overturn the judgment, and then we redo all the details, it's as if Rabbi Tarfon ruled it's fine, and the people fed it to the dogs. It even says Rabbi Tarfon fed it to the dogs, but we're still going to say you're really not responsible, because in the end, the ruling theoretically is, or in theory, it was retroactively overturned. Because again, what this is saying is very hard to understand, but what it's saying is, if the cow were in existence, it would have been overturned and nothing would have happened. So therefore, even though the cow's not in existence anymore, it's as if the ruling was overturned. It's almost like your immunity as a judge, that since we would overturn your ruling right now and you realize it's a mistake, it's as if it was already overturned. Okay. And therefore it was as if you actually didn't cause the loss of this cow. Okay. So I just want to follow the structure of the second answer. We have Rav Sheshet. He gave this distinction to Abba Dvar Mishnah to Abba Shikul Adat. We then did three things, okay? We had two questions. What else is included into Abba Dvar Mishnah, not just Mishnah, but other things as well. What's Shikul Adat? That was section number one. Section number two, Rav Hamnuna had a difficulty with Rav Sheshet. We resolved it. And then section number three was, and the whole thing was, what did Rabbi Akiva say? Shouldn't he have said something else? And the answer is, well, he really did. He said both. And then the third section was what happened, right? Why did Rav Hamnuna even ask his question? It seems like his question is irrelevant. And then we showed why the question's relevant. Okay, that was a kind of outside. And I didn't even put that question in the box or the other first two questions, because in the chart, what I really wanted was the answers and their difficulties, right? The resolution to the contradiction, so three resolutions, and what difficulty was raised on that. But section one and section three here weren't difficulties raised on it. One was just some explanatory questions. And the last part was a difficulty with the question itself, okay? Kind of like coming from the outside and saying, we're raising a difficulty. And by the way, that's charted, that's sort of organized underneath the chart on the study guide. Okay, now back to our Gemara. We're up to answer number three. We're up to Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda Amar. And this is going to be the most complicated in terms of the difficulty and all the responses to the difficulty. You can see in the box, in the chart, we're going to have a difficulty, an answer, a difficulty on the answer, a difficulty on the answer, a difficulty, and we're going to end with a kasha, okay? And then we're going to actually have, after we have this difficulty on Rav Chisda with the answer and then all these complications with the answer, we're then going to have a different answer, which is a much simpler answer. Okay, and that part's going to be a little easier. So in the end, we are going to resolve the difficulty against Rav Chisda, but it's going to take us a while, and the first attempt to resolve the difficulty is not going to work. That's just kind of seeing it outside before we get to into the details. Rav Chisda Amar, kan shenatal v'natam biyad, kan shelo natal v'natam biyad. When a judge rules, there's two options of what can happen. The judge can take the money and move it to the other side and physically get involved in the verdict and the outcome, right? And what should happen. And one is where the judge just says, this is the ruling, and then leaves it to them to deal with it. Now, which is stronger? The one where the judge actually moves the money from one hand to the other. So if it's stronger, we're going to say, if the judge then realizes the judge made a mistake, we're going to undo it. Okay? I'm sorry, I just said it wrong. If it's very strong, because the judge moved it by his own hand, then masha asasui. What's done is done. We don't undo it because it was a very strong ruling. The judge moved the money, moved it with his own hands. That gives it strength that we say masha asasui. That's the Mishna Bechorot. If you say lo natav v'natam biyad, the judge just ruled and then left it up to them to deal with, and then the judge realized the judge made a mistake, at that point the judge can undo the ruling, and that's our Mishnah. Okay, remember, our Mishnah, machzirim bein l'schut bein l'chova, right? You can undo the judgment. So that's Rav Chisda's answer. Now we're going to have a big difficulty. Bishlama chiyevet hazakai, kigon shenatal v'natam biyad. Chiyevet hazakai we get. If the judge says you have to pay the other side, and then the judge took the money and moved it to the other side, okay, that makes sense. But Ela zikat hachayav. Now the Mishnah Bechorot had two cases. It had four cases because it said timei tator tiara tatimei. We'll get back to that later. But right now we're dealing with zikat hachayav chayevet hazakai. Right? The judge first said you're exempt when you should have been guilty, or said you were guilty when you should have been exempt. Okay, right? Obligated when not obligated. Now, zikat hachayav. If the judge said you don't have to pay when you really did have to pay, and we just said that case when we say masha sasu is when the judge picked it up and moved hands. Well, no money moved hands. The judge says you're exempt. That means you didn't have to pay anything. So, hechi mishkachala. Da'amar paturata, right? What's the case? The judge says you're exempt. V'halon atav. The judge didn't move anything. So how could you establish that Mishnah and Ukimta and say it's only in a case where the judge physically moved the money, there was no money to move? That's a huge problem. So the first answer to this question, this is the one we're going to have two answers for. The first answer, which is going to take us a while, is Kevan da'amar paturata k'moshen atav v'natam biyad dami. They basically say, right, let's go through the first case. If the judge makes you pay the money, okay, the other case, which is the easier case, there's going to be two options. Either the judge moves the money, or the judge lets you deal with it on your own and lets you move the money yourself. And that's the distinction between the two Mishnayot. But if it's that the judge said you're exempt, because that kind of closes the judgment, it's as if the judge moved it on his own because it's such a, right, it's a done deal. You're exempt. So we're going to view that case of the judge saying you're exempt as if the judge moved the money himself. It's a little bit strange. And then we're going to reject this answer, but that's the answer. So now we say, but that can't work. Why can't it work? Rabbanit in our Mishnah, well, then how could you say our Mishnah is a case of dine mamonot can be switched either direction? Now, and our Mishnah is lo natal v'natam biyad. You can already see the problem. There is no case. If you say any case where the judge said you're exempt is going to be lo natal v'natam biyad, and that's why we're going to undo the judgment because it wasn't done so strongly in the first place. Well, if every time you say paturata, it's as if you natal v'natam biyad, the judge did it with his own hand, then there is no case of that the judge can return it to chovah and make the person pay, right? When first the judge said you were exempt, because it was already natal v'natam biyad, and then it's going to go into the case of well masha sasui. It's already a done deal. So that's what we're going to read right now. You can change it and overturn the ruling to go lischut, because what would the case be? First, the judge, the first case where the case of chovah works perfectly. I'm sorry, the case of schut works perfectly because first the judge said you're obligated, and our Mishnah would be a case you can overturn it. Why can you overturn it? Because the case would have to be where the judge didn't move the money on his own. Then, right? Then the judge wants to overturn the ruling. But what would the case of overturning it lechovah to obligate? It means first the judge exempted you. And didn't we just say ha'amarta kevan damar paturata? Since the judge exempted you already, that's as strong as it gets, right? The judge, it's done. Can't be overturned. So, the Gemara now changes this and says, we thought bein l'schut bein l'chovah means in both directions. Well, no. Bein l'schut bein l'chovah, what does it mean? So which is the one we're having a problem with? L'chovah. L'schut is first they obligated you, the judge didn't move the money on his own, and therefore we're going to overturn it and say you're exempt. But when it says to move it from exempt to obligated, we're going to say it like this. You can overturn it and exempt someone, not to obligate after you exempted. That for sure doesn't work because that's going to be the Mishna Bechorot. Masha sasui, it's done. But it's to a schut, which is a chovah. What does that mean? It means that we're going to say you're exempt. First, we obligated you, didn't move the money. Now we're going to say you're exempt, which means it's going to be an obligation to the other side. It's a case where there's two sides, and one person's going to lose out. In other words, the chidush here in the Mishnah is we can exempt you even though it's going to cause an obligation to the other side. Okay, now what's going to be the problem? Wait a minute. That's very nice to explain Dina Mamonot that way. And even though it said Bein l'schut bein l'chovah, which again we're going to eventually get back to and say that makes no sense because Bein l'schut bein l'chovah sounds like two cases. In the end, it's going to say it's not really because it's basically saying we're going to exempt you even though it's going to cause an obligation to someone else. But the continuation of the mission is, but in Dina Mamonot, not nefashot, we can only go in one direction, right? Now, b'dinei nefashot, we're only machzirim l'schut. What did we just say schut is? Schut is to exempt you when it's an obligation to somebody else. So now, you can't find that case in Dinei Nefashot. Right? What do we say? You can't be machzir l'chovah. Now, what does that mean? Machzirin l'schut, schut bredata. Okay, exempting you, we get it. We thought you were going to get the death penalty. Now we're going to let you, right? You're going to go free. But Ein machzirin lechovah. Now, what did we just say chovah was? We're now at the top of Amud Bet. Chovah is a schut for you, which is a chovah to someone else. So let's say you're on trial for murder. And basically, we're going to, right now, schutchi chovah, chovah means schutchi chovah. We thought you were deserving of the death penalty. Now, we want to exempt you, but it's going to cause an obligation to someone else. and we're not going to allow that. And we're actually going to obligate you. So, chovate deman. Who on earth could it be an obligation to, right? A chovatu, something bad if you get exempted. And then we're going to say also you can't do this, which is going to be another problem, but we'll get to there in a minute. Halokashya, chovte de goel adam. What do you mean? There's the relative. If we think you murdered someone, and we're going to put you on trial for murder, and the judge thinks you're guilty, then new evidence comes in, and the judge realizes you're not guilty. Well, the judge is going to say you're exempt, and who's going to be upset? It's going to be a chovah for the family. When there's a family that's going to be upset about this, we're not going to exempt you. Fascinating issue. So then the Gemara says, wait a minute. How could this possibly be? Okay, you understand what we have to do here? When we reinterpreted what it means in a moment, because we couldn't come up with a case of natav and natan biyad, no, lo natav and natan biyad in that case, we reinterpreted chovah as chut, which is a chovah to someone else. If we go then to the parallel in dinei nefashot, and we say that actually can't be done in dinei nefashot, even though it could be done in dinei mamonot. In dinei mamonot, we don't care that we're causing an obligation to someone else. In dinei nefashot, we can't do that. What's the chovah? The chovah is we're going to actually kill you, give you the death penalty, because, right? Because by exempting you now, even though we have new evidence that seems to exempt you, by exempting you, it's going to cause a chovah to someone else. The relatives of the dead person are going to be very upset. To which the Gemara obviously asks the obvious question. We know how careful Judaism is about not killing someone with the death penalty unless we're certain they're responsible. So in this case, because it's going to cause an obligation to, it's going to be upsetting to the family, we're going to actually give you capital punishment. That can't possibly be. Ve'od, and furthermore, my bain. And also going back to what I mentioned before, we're basically explaining dinei mamano, bain l'zchut, bain l'chovah are the same case. But when it says bain l'zchut, bain l'chovah, it's really two different cases. So this whole interpretation doesn't work. Kasha. So again, this was all within Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda said, we're going to differentiate Mishna, right? Our Mishna, lo natav natan biyad, less strong. Because it's less strong, we're going to overturn it. That Mishnah, natav natan biyad, very strong. And that's why it doesn't get overturned even when you find a mistake. Then when we said, well, what's a case where we exempted you originally and now we're going to obligate you, we're natav natan biyad. And basically the answer was every case of Torah is natav natan biyad, right? Anytime we say you're exempt, it's as if natav natan biyad, which then we couldn't explain our Mishnah because our Mishnah said there's two cases, and there are no two cases of lo natav natan biyad where the judge didn't do anything, because there is no case in exempting someone that could be natav natan biyad, and we can't come up with a case that the Mishnah said there's a case. So this doesn't work. Ravina gives a different answer. Ravina Amar kegon shahayalo biyado mashkon unitalo mimenu. Here's a case of exempt that could be lo natav natan biyad. Okay, what is that? If you're supposed to pay me back money, and the judge comes and says you're exempt, then right, we had a loan, you gave me a collateral, and now you claim you already paid back the loan, but I haven't given you back the collateral yet. So now, if the judge exempts you, it means the mashkon, the item I took collateral, has to go back to you. So let's say I have a watch of yours, I have to return the watch. So now that's the case where the judge exempted you in the beginning and returned the watch. Now here we could have either the judge took the watch with his own hands, or finally we find a case for our Mishnah of first exempted you, now wants to make you obligated, and because really you are obligated to return the loan, and theoretically I should get the mashkon back, but the judge had basically said, Michelle, you have to give the mashkon back to Ruth originally, and now realizes it was a mistake. And that was a case where the judge didn't move it himself. I just gave it back to Ruth, and that would be lo natav natan biyad, and that's a much simpler answer. Too bad we didn't start with that. It would have saved us that complicated part of the sugya. Okay, now what we have to still figure out, though, is timeat tahor v'tiheret tameh. If we're explaining the Mishnah in Bechorot, which listed those two as options, how are those cases where the judge, what we said, the Mishnah Bechorot, masha asasoy, it's done because the judge did something physically to implement the psak din. Well, to implement the verdict. How could you do that when you're metameh something that's tahor? You said this kli is impure and it's really pure. Or this kli is pure and it's really impure. Well, the judge doesn't do anything with his hands there. He just declares an item pure or impure. So, no, we're going to find a case. Timeat tahul de'age be'sheretz. The judge first ruled that this this food, let's say, is impure. And then turns out it was pure. But what did the judge do when he declared it impure in the first stage? The judge put a sheretz on top of it, which makes the food impure, to say, this is impure. And if you don't believe me, now I'm going to actually make it impure in some visual way. You all see the sheretz touch it. Everybody now knows it's impure and it's impure. And he put impurity on the food. So now when in the end they realized it was pure, the judge had already done something with his hand, right? And that was why the judgment is going to stay, because the judge did something showing how serious he was. And that's why it doesn't get undone. And also, it's too late to undo it because the judge already made it impure. Even if the first time it became impure, it wasn't really impure. And what about Tiheret Tatameh? Said something is pure when it's really impure. Well, Irvan Bein Perotav. So let's say it was a fruit that became impure, and now the judge took it and mixed it. So he said it was pure, when really, in fact, it was impure, but he didn't know that at the time. Mixed it up with all sorts of fruits that are pure. And now we don't know which one is which. And now we have a problem because the judge basically made it pure by mixing it up with other produce. And now that turns out we find out it was impure to begin with, now it's mixed up and we have no way of identifying it. So that would be cases where you could find Natal v'Natan b'Yad, where the judge did something physically, actually implemented the verdict physically with his own hands in a way that basically we're going to say whatever's done is done and we can't undo it. Okay, so those were our three answers. Again, mumche, eno mumche, ta'ab dvar mishnah or ta'ab shikul adat, or lo Natal v'Natan b'Yad versus Natal v'Natan b'Yad. Okay, now we're going to get to much easier parts of the sugya. Dine nefashot. So now we get to the part, this was really about dine mamonot, although we did touch on dine nefashot a little bit, but dine nefashot machzirin only lischut. You can't be machzir lechovah. If you exempted the person from the death penalty, you can't then come and say, oh no, you're obligated the death penalty. So now we're going to have a brighter with that source. Minayin tana rabbanan minayin liyotzei mi beit adin chayav va'amar echad yesh lelamed alav schut. Somebody walks out obligated, and somebody comes and said, wait, okay, after the verdict, wait, I have some way to exonerate him. How do we know we bring him back to court? And both of these drashot that we know yes, and that we know with case when not, are going to be learned out from the same pasuk. It's a pasuk in Shemot, chapter 23, verse 7. It says, Midvar sheker tochak, avoid lies, right? False things. Naki v'tzadik al taharog. An innocent and a righteous person don't kill, but we're going to define this righteous person a little bit differently in a minute. Naki al taharog. So it says, don't kill an innocent person. So even though you had a verdict saying the person's guilty and then you find out they're innocent, obviously you can't kill them. What if they walk out innocent? And somebody says, wait, I have something bad to say about them. I think they're guilty. How do you know you don't bring them back? Talmud Lamar, tzaddik al taharog. Now, tzaddik usually means, right, a righteous person. Here it means someone shehit tzdiku. You called him righteous. You said he was innocent, right? Latzdik is, we saw that, Bishop 2, right? The Yitzilu, I forget, or tzdiku et tzaddik, or Shiur tarasha, right? Latzdik is to say you're innocent. Once they say you're innocent, al taharog, you can't kill them anymore. Amar Rav Shimi bar Ashi, v'chiluf mesit. We get back again to this mesit, someone who steers other people to do idol worship. It's the opposite. This is the only exception to the rule. Dichtiv lo tachmo v'lo tchaseh alav. This is the pasuk we quoted before because it says don't have any mercy on this person, which means if they came out exempt, you can convict them after that if you have further evidence. Rav Kahana has a different pasuk he learns it from. Rav Kahana matne mi ki taharog targenu. By the Mesid it also says you should kill him, but a harog targenu is a double language, which means you should kill him if he's guilty, and even if he was innocent but then found guilty, you should kill him also. So there are two different pasukim about where we learn the Mesid from. Rabbi Zera asked Rav Sheshet the following question. Now we're going to see to how far does this apply. Comes Rabbi Zera and says to Rav Sheshet, how do we know that when you decide someone's supposed to go to Ir Miklat? Let's say you say someone killed accidentally and you have a ruling, you have a judgment, do you have to go to the refuge city or not? Now get to this in Mako, but it depends how close you were to, if it was so accidental you couldn't have even prevented it, then you don't have to go to the Ir Miklat. So what if they ruled that way? And then further evidence comes in and they realize, no, you have to go to the refuge city. So we won't do that. Just like in a murder verdict, we won't do it. Because it calls the one who killed b'shgaga a rotzeach, and it calls the one who kills intentionally a rotzeach. So they're really part of the same category. So whatever's true for a murder will be true for this as well, meaning once we exempted you, we can't obligate you. Chayve malkuyo. This is even more interesting. And you might remember we had a debate about malkuyo. Do we view it more? Is it in a court of 3 or 23, right? Is getting lashes like almost like you should have gotten the death penalty, but we're going to lighten your thing? Or is malkuyo something else entirely? This definitely sides on the side that it's like dinei nefashot, because they're going to say the same thing for malkut. If you get exempt and they rule you're not liable for lashes, and then they realize, oh no, you are, we don't give you lashes. Okay, and how do we learn that? Another Gzera Shava, Rasha. Okay, it says Vayam bin akota Rasha, and then it says don't take kofar for the rotzeach, don't take a ransom, Asher hu Rasha lamut, because he's a bad person who should die. So both of them are called a Rasha, and therefore we learn one is true for one is true for the other, right? Because it's true in Dinah and Nefasha, whatever applies there is going to apply for lashes. And very simply, we have a bright to support this Tanya Namihachi Chayve Galiot Minayin At Rotzeach Rotzeach Chayve Malkiot Minayin At Rasha Rasha. So the answer that Rosh Hashanah gave was actually found in an explicit brighta. Okay, last section for today. Ein machzirin lechova. So now we have you can't. This is what we said before. If you already exempted someone in Dinah Nefashot in a capital case, you cannot now obligate them. Amar Rabbi Chiur bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, v'hu sheta'a b'davar she'en hatzdukim modim bo. That's only if there is going to be a case where you can be machzir l'chova. If, okay, this is only in a case where the tzdukim are not modim. Now, what are the tzdukim? They hold by the literal Torah. They don't hold by the same oral tradition that we have. Okay, you could say they have their own oral tradition or they hold by the written Torah. But if it's something, ta'a b'davar she'atzdukim modim bo, if it's something so explicit in the Torah, Zil kare be'ravhu. That's everything. That's something that every kid in school knows. Every little kid reads Torah, knows Torah. If it says it explicitly in the Torah, Shebechtav, in the written Torah, and the judge, for whatever strange reason, made a mistake about it, even if they exempted the person from murder, we can now obligate them for murder if they made such a basic mistake. It's funny how they word it, like the tzdukim, right? Even though they were so against the tzdukim, but there's certain things we agree with about them. And if the judge makes a mistake in something basic like that even the tzdukim agree with us about, for sure we're going to undo that judgment. What if it was a case of adultery and there was a mistake and they basically exempted the adulteress or the adulterer? And, would we then obligate them? To which he said, Amrle, Adimokdach yakid, while your fire's still burning, zil kutz kra utzle. Stick your gourd on and roast it while the fire's still going. Meaning, you were just talking about this topic. While you're on the topic, obviously, in other words, everyone knows that an adulteress get the death penalty. So, of course, yes, that would obviously be a case you would overturn. Itmarnami Amar Rabbi Amar Rabbi Yochanan ta'ab no'ef choser. Okay, if you made a mistake in this kind of case, you would be choser. So what would be a case of no'ef and no'efet that you wouldn't be? You wouldn't overturn? With this, we'll finish for today. Amar Rabbi Abahu Amar Rabbi Yochanan kigon sheta'asha lo kedarka. There's bi'asha lo kedarka, which is the way homosexual sexual relationship would happen. It would be the same for a man and a woman. That was also forbidden by Torah law, but it doesn't say so explicitly. It's learned from a drasha of mishkevei isha. The man should not have homosexual relations with another man, and it says it in plural. So they learn from there that even with a woman, it would be forbidden if, let's say, a man who's not allowed to sleep with a woman engages in relations in that way. But that's already something that's only rabbinic law. That would be something that if they made a mistake and thought that you were exempt and then realized, they wouldn't obligate you. Okay, that's it for today. Our main topic was this idea. It was all about overturning judgments. What could be overturned in Dinah Mominot? What could be overturned in Dinah Nefashot? We started with this whole thing. It looks like Dinah Mominot isn't overturned at all from the Mishna Bechorot. And for that, we had 3 possible distinctions between our Mishna and that Mishna. And then we got to Dinah Nefashot. How do we know you don't overturn it l'chovah? And then we saw that there are exceptions to that rule. And with that, we finished for today. Wishing everyone a good day, a good week, and may the hostages return as quickly as possible. Be a safe day. Wishing everyone a good day and a Shavua Tov.